I do want to just first kind of finish this. We haven't completed this, so let's complete this. And so what we had done on Thursday was we laid out the structure, the template for the model, for the debt schedule, which there's three major areas. The way I like to think about it is first the cash available. How much cash you can have and use to pay down debt. Now, how do you use that cash to pay down debt? We'll talk about that today. We didn't get to that on Thursday. Then the second section is just laying out all the pieces of debts, and I recommend to lay out every single one as represented by the balance sheet. Look to the balance sheet to figure out which, if there's 5 different pieces of debts, I would lay out 5 different pieces in the debt schedule. And that's what we did. I don't combine the short-term portion and the long-term portion. Some people do. You can, if you want to. So we had short-term borrowings, long-term debt due within a year, obligations within capital leases due in 1 year. So I separated the short-term components from the long-term components because that's the way the debt schedule did it. If you combine it here, you'd have to combine it that's the way the balance sheet did it. If you combine it here, you'd have to combine it on the balance sheet, and that might just extra work. It's not right or wrong. Then at the bottom we totaled stuff, right? We totaled the interest expenses, totaled the issuances, and calculated cash at the end of the year that is supposed to match the cash that we have represented on the balance sheet. It's not the same cash number. In other words, you're not linking it, but you're calculating it in 2 different ways. And that's where the match is helpful in determining whether you're doing the debt schedule correctly or not. I think a lot of times you'll see a no in your debt schedule match, which means either you have cash at the end of the year calculated incorrectly, or you haven't linked things fully through. So this is another proof. So what we had done was we had first laid out each piece of debt and then dug into the Walmart financials to determine the appropriate interest rates using tables that we found and dug up. We calculated interest on each, and then we totaled up the interest and linked the interest to the income statement. When doing that, we noticed that the cash number changed, and we ended with asking why. Why does the cash number change? And I guess the first question is, does the cash number go up or does it go down once you link interest expense into the income statement? What effect does that have? Why is that dependent? Or why does it, create an effect on the cash available to pay down debt?
Reduces the net income.
What's that?
Reduces the net income. Therefore reduces the cash.
Interest and additional interest expense reduces net income. Net income hits the cash flow statement. Cash flow statement affects what specific line item in here? Not cash at the beginning of the year. That's the overall balance. Not cash at the beginning of the year. But what's it impacting? Important to understand for interviews.
It's like cash before debt pay down,
Cash before debt pay down. Why?
because it's our cash available before you pay any kind of debt.
Start to think about it. The cash before debt pay down comes from the actual cash flow statement, which is a sum of all the line items in the finance activities that do not include debts, plus all the investing activities, plus all the operating activities, which includes net income. That's the only effect net income has in the debt schedule. It's this line, the cash that's available to pay down the debt. So make sure you think about that. And we're going to hone in on this a little bit more today. So it's important that you have a good understanding of debt schedule. Like I said, this is one that's not linear. It takes a while to get. It takes practice to get this one, right? Everything else, income statement, you do 1 year, you just copy to the right, right? Balance sheet, you do 1 year, you copy to the right. Debt schedule is a little bit all over the place. So it's tough to get. But so to calculate cash at the end of the year, which should match the cash balance as per the balance sheet, you start with cash at the beginning of the year. That's the balance as of January 1st. This balance has been sitting on the balance sheet. Then you add in this cash number that represents the cash before debt pay down, or the all the cash generated, not including debt pay downs, excluding debt pay downs. We want to exclude debt pay downs from that number because it's the purpose of the debt schedule to determine how much cash we can use for debt pay downs. So in order to get a complete picture of cash at the end of the year, you want to start with cash at the beginning of the year, 6550, plus all the cash generated. But this number, 492.2, is all the cash generated excluding cash from debt paydowns. So we are missing the cash from debt paydowns, which is represented by the total issuances. So if you take cash at the beginning of the year, you add cash flow before debt paydowns, and add this, which represents the cash from the debt paydowns, that's the total cash at the end of the year. That's the way it works. Let's demonstrate that. So, okay, so let's say I have 6042 in cash available to pay down debt. Is this going to work? Yes. 6042 in cash available to pay down debt. Okay, 6042. So let's say I want to pay down my long-term debt. You'd probably want to pay down your short-term debt, but this, what I'm trying to illustrate won't have an impact here because the interest rate is so small. I want to illustrate the impact of interest. So let's take long-term debt. I'll say, okay, so if I have 6042.2 in cash, I want to pay down 6042.2 in long-term debt. How do you use a debt pay down? I will, just for now, I'll explain the difference between these two. You probably know about it, but I'm going to do minus 6042.2 in 2013, illustrating I'm going to force a debt pay down. Minus 6042.2 in 2013 mandatory issuances. 6042.2. Yeah? What happens? Debt goes down. Yeah? What happens to cash? Cash went up. Right? Cash was 6042.2. I tried to pay down all that I could. Why does it go up? It's important to start understanding that. Why did cash go up? Because I paid down debt.
I was also expecting to see there that the total cash available is going to reduce.
Right. It did not. Yeah, yes, absolutely. It's a circular reference, but walk me through it. So you're right.
Because you have put down
Mhm.
debt and it goes back to the cash flow statement. Which will increase the cash flow, pay down, which will increase the total cash flow, which is
Yeah. So you pay down debt. You pay down debt, what happens? Interest goes down. Why did interest go down? How much did interest go down by? You don't need an exact number, but by the principal and what's that, George? Times interest rate. Not by the principal you paid down necessarily. Why?
The interest rate on the
Not necessarily in the model. Exactly why? Take an average. It's not strict principal times the rate. It's the average interest rate we take on the average of last year's principal and this year's principal. It's not necessarily the principal paid down times the rate. You don't know when you've paid it down, and there's days allocated to that. Okay. Okay. Interest expense goes down because you've paid down debt. What happens? Interest expense goes down. Where does interest expense flow to? Where did it go? My interest expense was, before I paid this down, 1983. So it's gone down to 1847. It's not a full 6042 times the rate, because there's an average involved. You don't know when you paid that down. You could have paid that down at the beginning of the year and got full interest reduction. You could have paid down the last day of the year. But we don't know that, so we take an average. Where does that interest expense go? Income statement. So income statement interest expense has reduced, right? So what happens to net income? It goes up. Net income goes up. What else goes up? So what cash? So what made cash? What line item specifically made cash go up from 6042.2 to 6137? Cash flow before that pay down. This is the only line item that's impacted by net income. I have a little bit more cash that I can utilize to pay down a little bit more debt because of interest savings. That's the circular reference. It's important to start thinking about that. So I had 6042.2, right? Now I have 6137. I've saved 94.8. 94.8. I can pay down 94.8 because of the interest savings. Where's that 94.8 come from? Who can walk me through the formula generally? It's what? Basically just what we said, but recapping. 94.8 is... Anybody? Excess what? Did you say excess? It's not the taxes. It comes from the reduction of interest, right? Right, and 94.8 is the cash is reduced by the reduction of interest, right? What else? Times 1 minus tax rate. Right? Right? Because you get interest expense, then you have to adjust it for taxes, which reduces net income. Maybe that's what you meant, George, but I don't know. I thought maybe you were saying that was the tax number. So what I can do is I can pay down 94.8 more. So I'm going to add to this 604.2. I'm going to say, all right, well now I just realized I can pay 94.8 or 98.4. 94.8 more, I think. So I'm going to add to this negative 6042.2 minus 94.8. The additional cash that I freed from paying down debt, from reducing interest, from freeing up more cash. Now what happens? 6137. Cash goes up by a little more. 6138.5. It was 6137. Why did it go up a little bit more? Why did it go up a little more?
Because we
saved additional interest expense. We've reduced debt by additional 98.4. That's reduced interest by the average of the ending balances times the rate, which has reduced interest, which has reduced net income by that interest times 1 minus the tax rate, which has increased cash by that amount. And that came to about an additional 1.5. So how much more did I save? 1.5. So I got a little bit more cash saved that I can use to pay down a little bit more debt. 1.5. I'm going to add to this minus 1.5. And my cash should go up. Well, maybe it won't. Maybe that's it. Let's see. It didn't. That's it. It may be a decimal. Probably decimal. Right? So this is the circular reference. But there's a benefit there. And there's a necessity in terms of figuring out, as you're paying down debt, how much cash you can free up immediately to further pay down debt, to maximize your debt pay down. Or the other way to look at it is, like I said on Thursday, how much debt can you possibly raise and still have enough cash available to meet your interest payments? Important in leverage buyout analyses, which we'll talk about. So now, this whole process of looking at how much cash you have and then paying it down, and looking at the cash again and paying down a little bit more, and looking at the cash again and paying down a little bit more, we automate it. Right? You don't have to do this manually. This iterative process is automated by the Excel iterations box. I don't know if you've ever dealt with the iterations. You're telling Microsoft to go through its own iterations. We just did manually. But this only works if we put in a logical formula that would allow the circular reference to pass. So how do we do that? Well, I guess you can use a switch, if that's what you're saying, but there's another way to do it, right? Yep, the min function. What happened here? But I wanted you to know what it means. So this is what we're trying to do. We are trying to automatically detect if we have cash to pay down the debt. There's a set of logical conditions we need to satisfy. Why? Who can help me think this through? You can't, yes, sure.
Because it might be that we get into a situation where we cannot pay any debt.
Yeah.
Because we have an action plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is, cash has to be positive. Cash could be negative. If cash is negative, then what would have to happen, Struggle?
I'm sorry?
If cash is negative,
We end up not paying any interest or debt.
you got to raise debt. Daniel, sorry, you were going to answer that.
Yeah.
So we want the debt schedule to handle that. If cash is negative, we got to raise debt because we'll be in deficit. But now, if cash is positive, which was this case, then what do we want to do? Pay as much as you can. But that's dependent on something.
The minimum cash, right?
The minimum cash, well, you mean this cash, yeah? The cash after the cushion. Yeah, the cash available to pay down debt. But what about that cash, Daniel?
You only pay it down if you owe any money, so if you pay it down.
So if there's no debt, you won't pay it down. What else? You could pay down the short term, but let's say we're just focusing on the short term for now.
Pay down the mandatory portion, and pay down the non-mandatory.
Okay, so let me just explain the difference between mandatory and non-mandatory. And I should have, but now's a good time to do it. The reason we have two, this is a modeling thing. This isn't a accounting thing. So they both represent, negative represents debt pay down, positive represents debt issuances, whether it's mandatory or non-mandatory. Mandatory is just the principal payments. This is what's contracted that we owe and have to pay year after year after year. You raise long-term debt. Sometimes they say that the debt amortizes over 20 years, like a mortgage payment, which means you're supposed to pay that debt divided by 20. You're supposed to pay that amount of debt every single year. That's a principal payment. That's mandatory. Okay? And we'll model something like that out in the leveraged buyouts. The non-mandatory is only reserved for this automatic formula that we're designing, where we're going to create a formula that says if we happen to have cash, let's just pay down as much as we can, assuming that's possible. That's automatic. We want to create a formula and have it not interfere with mandatory payments, because sometimes you might have mandatory payments, but you might want to create this formula above and beyond that, and you don't want, so we separate that into two line items, so we don't have an automatic formula that is, how do we have an automatic formula when we have principal payment at the same time? So we separate that into two lines. So the mandatory issuances is just reserved for hard codes, things that are planned that you know, and the non-mandatory is this automatic formula. So right now, we want to determine if cash is positive, right? Because if cash is negative, we have to raise debt. But if cash is positive, what happens? What else do we have to look for? Why?
Debt is more than cash, then we can only pay as much cash as we can.
Yeah.
Cash is more than debt, and we the amount of the debt.
Right. So if cash is greater than zero, then you got to compare cash with the debt, right? Because if cash was 100 and debt was 200, well, I did, yeah, so if debt was 50, I'm not going to pay down 100. I don't need to, right? I only pay down the amount of debt. On the other hand, if cash was less than debt, in other words, if cash was 100 but debt was 500, I can't pay all the debt down. I don't have enough cash for that. So you need to compare the cash to the debt to see how much of that debt can you pay down. And then Daniel, that was satisfied. If debt's zero, then you just won't pay anything down. That'll work in these formulas. So if cash is greater than debt, then pay all debt. Pretty simple. If cash is less than debt, then you just pay as much as you can. That should handle all possibilities. So you want to first check to see if cash is positive. If cash is positive, if it's negative, then you have a different problem. You got to raise debt. If it's positive, then you have to pay down the debt. But how much do you pay down? It depends on if cash is greater than debt or not. That's what you have to look for. So how do we convert this into a formula that we could put in our Excel? Well, I'll help you out a little bit. First of all, we want to simplify this. I mean, pay as much as you can. How do you interpret that? So, in other words, if cash is negative 0, we want it to raise debt. If cash is negative 100, what do we want to see as output in our mandatory issuances box? Plus 100, which is represented by what? Negative of the cash. Raised debt can be easier seen as negative cash. If cash is less than 0, then I want to see in that cell negative cash. Negative 100. This positive 100. Negative cash. If cash less than 0, then return negative cash. Okay? Anyone confused? Everyone okay with that? Kind of? What happens if cash is greater than 0? Well, let's say cash is 100. Positive 100. Right? Then what? Then we have to go into these two conditions. If cash is greater than debt, so let's say that cash is greater than debt. Let's say that is. Let's say this is true. Cash is positive. Cash is greater than debt.
So we pay down a minimum of cash and debt.
Well, not in this case. There's only one choice. Which is, you're about to say? Say again? Minus debt. Pay down the debt. Right? It will never, the minimum will always be minus debt. Pay down the debt. minus debt, right? This will always be the case, always. Cash is greater than debt, this is always the case. So cash is greater than debt, minus debt. I want to see negative 50, pay down the debt, minus 50. Yeah? If cash is less than the debt, then what happens? How much do we pay down? Negative cash, right? As much as you can is this is I can't pay this. I don't have enough cash for that. I gotta pay that. If cash is less than the debt, paying as much as I can means pay as much cash that I have. Negative cash. Negative 100. Right? No. Why? This will bring that down to 400?
Yeah, but you have to also raise the money to pay it off to them.
No, you just casually, if you have cash, you're gonna pay it down. It's not a requirement. Assuming we're not required to pay down that debt. Right? If cash was 50 and debt was 200, what do we pay down? Cash is less than debt? 50, right? If cash is 200 and debt is 100, what are we paying down? 100. If cash is 500 and debt was 1,000, what are we paying down? Negative 500, right? Always the smaller of the two, right? You're always paying down the minimum, no matter what. And this is why James was saying, you can look at these two equations as the minimum of cash or debt, just the smaller of the two, whatever is more available to me. But it's not the minimum, it's negative the minimum, because I want to represent a pay down as a negative. The negative the minimum of cash and debt handles my pay downs as long as cash is positive. Yeah? You guys okay with that? No? What if cash is negative?
So you pay down the maximum of that function and 0. So it's like
Overthinking it.
pay nothing. Just pay nothing.
Underthinking it.
Should we raise it up? 500.
You're on the right track. This is what you want to see, first of all. And I think what you said wasn't incorrect. There's a quick way to get to it. What if cash was negative 100? And that was 0. Where's 100? Right? This is also the minimum. But it's the minimum of cash and 0. Because it's negative. Right? But also notice that debt can never be negative. Right? So what if I said 500? What if debt was 10 billion? It's going to be 500, right? What if debt was, 20 billion here? It's still going to be 100. It doesn't matter. Debt can be anything. Debt can be infinite, right? It doesn't matter here. If cash is negative, then the minimum of cash and 0, or the minimum of cash and debt, it's always going to give you this, because this is the only negative number, because debt can never be positive. So, negative minimum cash and debt also works here. It works everywhere. It works everywhere. If cash is negative, it would always give me negative the negative cash or positive cash. It would raise that cash. And it's really important that you understand the logic behind this, because for things like leverage buyouts, you're going to have to create your own debt min-max combination formulas to handle different kinds of conditions. But it's important to at least know this. It's in the book. Step through it. And we'll do it again for leverage buyouts. Let's test it, right? So let's say short-term borrowings revolver. I'm going to do negative. Well, let's just do it in the long-term debt, because I want to show you that it gets to the same thing that we did before. So 613.5, I'm going to go 0. I'm going to do in the non-mandatory negative minimum, open parentheses, the long-term debt, cash debt, debt cash, same thing, comma, the cash, and let's stress test the formula. You should always stress test the formula. Let's make sure it works under each of those conditions. Hit enter, 6138.5. So it's gone through all the iterations that we did manually. Now, if some of you guys have an error message that pops up, that means you did not set your Excel to handle circular references. Your Excel from here on out should be set to handle circular references. The way to do that is you might have different versions of Excel, but in mine, which is the 2013, you go to File, Options. There's one that has the whatever 4-colored symbol in the top left. You can hit that in Options, or sometimes you have to hit this X. I think if you have a Mac, this little Excel symbol, and then go to Options. As long as you get to Options, the box should look similar to this. Just make sure you're getting to Formulas. I think the Apple one has a whole bunch of icons. There should be one called Calculations or Formulas, either Formulas or Calculations. And this checkbox, Enable Iterative Calculation, says, I understand there's a circular reference. I want you to cycle through several iterations. Maximum 100, right? We went through 3, right? You want to tell us, go through 100 is enough, right? If you don't have that iterations box checked, it'll see a circular reference as an error, right? It'll see a circular reference as there's something, you'll see this. If I uncheck this, it'll tell me. You probably have seen this. There's this found a circular reference. We want to say, yes, we have a circular reference in the model. Just continue that loop 100 times. So I'm going to put that back in. $61385. And we know it works because you notice the cash at the end of the year matches the minimum cash cushion. We want to pay down as much as we can, yet hold that minimum cash cushion aside. It's worked. You won't match. Why are we not matching? What's off? Nope. Let's see if you can think about this. What's this trying to tie to? Nope. The cash? Balance sheet. So what's the balance sheet cash number? Right. Balance sheet cash is 7138.5. Why is it not 1,000 that we just calculated?
We still have other debt to pay down.
Not necessarily. Well, that's true, but that wouldn't.
There's like a pecking order. For example, you have to pay down the short-term borrowing first, and you have less amount of cash to pay down the extra debt.
True.
So,
but that wouldn't. Although that's true, that wouldn't make this number different than the one that's actually on the cash flow statement. Yes, Dan. Yeah. Yes, the cash is not being reduced on the balance sheet by the pay down of debt. This is the way I want you to be thinking about these models, not going in cell by cell, right? This cash has not gone down to the 1,000. What's 7138.5 minus 1,000? It did not go down by the 6138.5. That was the pay down that we just modeled. Why is it not going down by that? What drives that? Where does this cell come from? Year before plus change in cash equivalents. And what's missing here? This should reflect my debt paydown. Negative 6138.5. Why did it not? What's missing here? I didn't put the payments. The payments that we just calculated aren't linked in here. Right? The payments of the debts need to be linked in here. If the payments were linked in here, the issuances and retirements, cash would go down, and this would match the debt schedule. So it's a common problem that you guys have, and that's why we have that match, to make sure that the payments are tying through. So we'll have to link. That's the final link in a operating model, is to make sure the issuances and retirements link into the cash flow statement. Okay, before we do that though, let's stress test this a little bit more. So this is the case where I have 44 billion in debt. I have less cash. I paid down as much as I could, right? What happens if I have more cash than debt? So I'm going to zero out this formula. And I'm going to go up. And let's look at the short-term debt, where I have less debt than cash. I want to stress test the formula. The minimum formula should result in negative 4047, nothing beyond. Right? Negative min, open parentheses, 4047, comma 60422. The lesser of the two it should return. And it does, right? So it works. So I've tested a situation where the cash was less than the debt. I've tested a situation where the cash is greater than the debt. What happens if the cash is negative? It should raise debt. How do I stress test that? Well, what I'll do for now is I'll just force the minimum cash cushion to be so great that it would require a cash need. So if I make the minimum cash cushion, let's say 10,000, cash is negative, it should raise debt to fill that cash need. That works. So if you're jotting down things to start to learn and practice, it's how this works. For interviews, no one's going to ask you about this, so don't worry too much. If you're doing a model case though, it would look good if you can have a debt schedule with a minimum cash cushion in it. So I would at least memorize the formula. It should be easy to memorize. Negative min, cash, and debt. Even I didn't really think it through or really get it until maybe towards second year, maybe even end of my second year. It's just modeling and modeling. You don't really step back and think about this stuff. That's why we're doing it here. But so you just need to know that it exists and to put it in. You definitely do need to know, though, the circular reference. People could ask you, walk me through the circular reference. You need to know how that works, meaning you pay down debt, that reduces interest. A reduction in interest is a reduction in an expense. A reduction in an expense increases net income. An increase in net income increases cash. That gives you more cash to pay down more debt. You pay down more debt, you have more of a reduction in interest. More of a reduction in interest is more of a reduction in an expense. More of a reduction in an expense is more of an increase in income, which is more of an increase in cash, and that cycles through. You got to at least talk through that for interviews and memorize the min formula if you do case studies. So What's the minimum formula?
Yeah, no.
Oh, this circular referencing?
Yeah.
When the cash meets the minimum cash cushion, or when the cash available to pay down debt goes to zero. Right? So cash at the end of the year will always match the minimum cash cushion. But this circular reference, yes, stops when the cash available to pay down debt goes to zero. You've spent all the cash that you wanted to spend. It won't raise debt only if the cash available to pay down debt is negative in the beginning will it raise debt. But if it was positive, then it's going to try to spend all that $6 billion. It won't spend beyond that $6 billion. So get to know this min formula. We'll use it quite a bit in cases and buyouts and things like that. So just start to become familiar with it. And just for now, memorize it and start to walk yourself through. It's all chapter 6. Reread that. Okay, now, the thing is, although it's nice to have the ability to pay down debt at will, these big Fortune 500 companies, they often don't do that. Actually, they often penalize if they decide to pay cash whenever they want to, right? Lenders make money on having their loans sit on their balance sheet. And if Walmart decides to pay down $44 billion in debt, lender could be out of business, right? Where's their interest? So there's penalties. So a lot of times companies just don't pay down debts when you want to. You would do that in a revolver, although I call this a revolver. Walmart's doesn't have a revolver. I just call it a revolver. The reason why I call it a revolver is because I wanted to put it in the book, is because it's a very common analysis for an analyst to have to do, so I wanted to put it in there. But in reality, and we'll look at Walmart's financials, they're not paying down their debts anytime soon. So it's important to have a switch or something that allows you to turn on or off these pay down capabilities. So you'll use switches for a lot of different situations. If you have cases or you have a model with complexities that you might want to turn on or turn off, right? Like issue debt, yes or no, right? You know, I'll show a case when you issue the debt, and I'll show a case where I don't issue it. Instead of saving 2 models, put a switch in, right? Mandatory issuance retirement, yes or no, right? I want a switch that says, yes, I want to pay down the debt if I could, or no, I want to keep the debt on there. So the way a switch works is, a simple one is, and we'll get more complex stuff, but just simple 1 or 0. I can call it pay down. 1 is yes, 2 is no, whatever. 1 is yes, 0 is no. And very simply, I'm just going to take this formula and I'm going to multiply it by that number. All right? If the number is 1, the formula is active. If the number is 0, no matter what the formula produces, it's going to give you 0. So I'm going to multiply by F14, anchor it so I can copy this to the right. Anchor F14 so I can copy this to the right. And so what happens is if the pay down is 1, meaning yes, the formula will multiply by 1, which will give you whatever the formula is meant to represent. If it's 0, it'll just give you 0, right? Because anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So I'm just going to copy this to the right. Knowing that if I want to pay down the debt, I put 1. If I don't want to, I put 0. And it's good just to have. You can do that for all the types of debts that you have. First, basic intro into switches and drop boxes and all this additional Excel functionality that we'll start to do when we get into M&A and LBO analyses.
Yeah, we might go back up.
To this? Oh. Okay.
What about the cell on the right?
Yeah, F15 is anchored. Yeah, make sure you anchor the reference to F15 so when you copy to the right, that will all shift to the right. Okay. Now, still doesn't match, right? Because we need to link in our pay downs into the cash flow statement. So if you go to the cash flow statement though, you'll see, well, first, if you go to the cash statement, you'll see there's an area for short-term borrowings and repayments. So we need to link the payments that we've modeled into here in order for our model to properly balance. So cell G29 should be equal to the debt schedule. And I do a sum of the mandatory and non-mandatory issuances and retirements, any potential short-term debt paydowns. Right? 4047. So this should do two things. This is going to finally reduce our cash, so our cash balance matches. This will also finally reduce the debt on the balance sheet, because if you notice, the debt on the balance sheet has not been reduced, even though we've modeled out our debt paydowns, because we have not properly linked this through. This is the final link you want in your model. Well, almost. There's just income on the cash. Now, notice we have a row for long-term debt borrowings, capital lease obligations. We don't have rows for long-term debt due within a year and capital lease obligations due within a year. So the cash flow statement on the Walmart financials did not separate that out. So what I'd recommend doing is adding rows to handle that. Just make it 0 historically, and link it in so that if we end up modeling a pay down here, it'll link through and balance. So on the cash flow statement, I recommend adding 2 rows. One for, I'm just going to copy and paste the actual wording. One for long-term debt due within a year, and obligations under capital leases due within a year. I'll just append it to say long-term debt due within a year, borrowings. I mean, you don't really need to be this exact with the wording. And it'll be 0 historically. But we're just going to link these rows in from the mandatory and non-mandatory issuances and retirements. So take a second and get that done while I save this. Okay, so 22nd. And you want to link in each debt from the cash flow statement. Sorry, from the debt schedule. So long-term debt due within a year will link in from the sum of the mandatory and non-mandatory issuances and retirements. And the obligations under capital leases will link in from the sum of the obligations under capital leases, mandatory and non-mandatory issuances and retirements. and the long-term debt borrowings and repayments. We'll link in from the mandatory, non-mandatory, and long-term debt. And finally, the capital lease obligations will link in from the mandatory and non-mandatory capital lease obligations. And so you should match now. Yes. Any questions on that? Okay, almost done with the model. The last piece, and what I want to do is, I'm going to put the pay down at 0. I want to go and analyze Walmart's pay downs, but let's just put in the last link. And the last link is the cash at the end of the year should generate some interest. This is cash and cash equivalents. Cash equivalents are like CDs, small, very liquid accounts that generate a small percentage of interest expense. And so the problem with that is oftentimes the company doesn't really disclose because it's nominal where their interest income comes from. Usually very small, 0.5, 1%. And the formula that you take is just like interest expense. You'll take an average of the beginning or the ending balance of this year and last year, or the beginning and ending balance times some rate. And I would just fudge some rate that kind of matches the interest expense that they've had prior years. You shouldn't see a big jump or reduction in interest expense unless they are changing their investment strategy, and then they would announce that. So, you know, or sometimes they might have a paragraph on cash equivalents that will explain the interest that they're generating. But if it's going to be somewhere, it's going to be very small. So, first of all, let's just take a 1% and let's see what that looks like. Interest income is going to be an average of this year and last year times the rate. And so 68, and this we do the same thing like we do with depreciation. 68, it was 162, yeah? So I think 68 is quite low. So what would 2% be? 135. I think I used 2.5 in the book. That's all I'm going to do. This is nominal. 169.9. Yeah, that's pretty close. So I'm going to pull this in. Remember to pull it as a negative because it offsets the expenses, right? Where the expenses are positive, we show the income as negative. We show income as negative while expenses are positive. So I'm going to pull this in as a negative. Debt schedule, 169.9. And notice it's gone up. Why did it go up? It was 169.9. I linked it in. I linked it in. 169.9. Oh, why did I delete like that? I linked it in. And it goes up immediately. Is that weird? Why did it go up? Why did the interest income go up as soon as I pulled it in? I want to try. I think it's 2.5. What's the reason for it? circular reference, that's for sure. It's got the opposite effect than interest expense. You put interest income in, what does that do? Gives you more cash. You get more cash, what do you do with more cash? Pay on more debt. You pay on more debt, what happens? Cycles through. Keep thinking about that. I actually stepped through some of these in the book. I just want to make sure this is 2.5%. 2.5%. Okay. Now that you have a circular reference in the formula, you might have, and already with the models that you're working on, you might have seen something like this. Let's see. Get to it? Yeah, like that. Right? Have you ever seen a busted model like that? All the way through? No? If you haven't, you will. Right? The reason why that's happening is because you must have accidentally typed in a string, right, which is anything that's not a number, into one of these cells that Excel cannot calculate, right? So I put a P in there, right, in the heart of the circular reference, or in one of the links within the path of the circular reference. So a lot of times what happens is maybe you're typing in the formula and you forgot to put an equal sign, and until you put in an equal sign, it's going to treat this as a word, right? It's not going to calculate it. That happens a lot. And then you undo it, and that's it. It's caught in this endless loop of errors. Right? So the only way to fix that is you have to fix the problem. So I fixed the problem. I took the P out. I put a working formula back in. That fixes the original problem, but it doesn't solve this circular series of mistakes because it's calculating errors all the way through the loop now. You have to break the circular reference. Let Excel recalculate as normal and then put the circular reference back in. So to break the circular reference, find a point that's kind of the heart of it. So one point is, I always like to just go to the interest expense, interest income. It's usually one of these links that start the circular reference. And just delete it. Highlight everything and delete it. If you delete it, it will recalculate because there's no more circular reference as normal, and just double check. If there's still some value things, then you have another problem that you didn't uncover yet. Once it calculates, put those links back in. You can just Control-Z, you can just undo. Right? And then it's fixed. So just fix the problem, break the circular reference, undo, put it back in. So you'll see that a lot. Okay, I want to just tie up some loose ends. We have some red things here, variables here. I want to analyze the results, and then I want to get into a little bit of evaluation overview. And so let's take a break.